to discuss a little bit with you where we stand at this particular point in time. The Future of Work initiative is already, has concluded at the centenary of the ILO, which was in 2019, which, at least from my perspective, seems to like a lifetime away. I mean, there was a lot of talk of the future, but I think even the most pessimistic punters at the time could have never imagined a crisis and a pandemic as we have seen over the last year and a half. So what I would like to take you through today is to discuss a little bit the structure of the Future Work Initiative, very, very briefly highlight some aspects for some of you who may not be familiar with what the ILO has been working on, to discuss very much the political outcome of this process, which is the Centenary Declaration, which was adopted in 2019, and then to discuss whether this is actually still relevant for some of the most pertinent policy discussions that we're having today. So as you can see, and I think Rosa has already mentioned it very well, is that the accelerating changes we see in the world of work pushed the ILO and the Director General back in 2015, 2016 to have a very specific discussion of what the future of work actually holds into account. And as such, and as you know, we've had a sort of a bottom-up approach of national dialogues in most countries around the world, followed by, as Rosa already mentioned, the High-Level Global Commission, which published this report. And this was then very much the basis for the discussions we had at the International Labour Conference in 2019. So a little bit, this is the declaration that came out of this Future Work Initiative was hugely important at the time, given that it was really a political statement by all member states, by all constituents of the ILO, of some of the most pertinent issues that the world of work was facing at the time. And I just want to briefly highlight some of the main points that were mentioned in this declaration, and they're very much linked to what has already been said. But we have a political document where every single member state made a commitment to social dialogue, to the importance of multilateralism, and how this is very much the backbone and how we are going to, as the ILO, together with our constituents, achieve what is, you know, the mandate that we have of social justice, in sort of reference to some of the work that we've been doing also within the multilateral system. So that was very much one of the main statements that came out of this declaration. The second one I wanted to present to you was something that the Global Commission report was also quite strong on, and also already mentioned, the relevance of the social contract and the employment relationship. So, you know, we know for a fact that sadly in most places in the world this is not the case, but it is imperative that if we are to actually achieve a more equitable world, to achieve more equitable labor markets, we need to have reaffirmed the relevance of the employment relationship, which, due to numerous factors, be it globalization, be it advancements in new technologies, has been eroding over the last few decades. This includes, and this is very crucial, that all workers should enjoy respect for their fundamental rights, an adequate minimum wage, maximum limits in working time, which again is crucial if you consider some of the COVID measures that have been implemented recently, and of course safety and health at work. Again, a topic that has been discussed very much at length over the last 18 months or so. Lastly, I just wanted to highlight some of the policy elements of the declaration, which again, you know, are highlighted, particularly also from a worker's perspective. And these are some of the elements that I find, you know, we are still discussing today at greater length. Crucially, the Centenary Declaration made links between workers' rights and sustainable and inclusive growth. There's numerous bodies of work, numerous studies that show that if we are to engage more, if workers' rights, such as the right to freedom of association, right to collective bargaining, and so on and so forth are being actually adhered to, this is also has huge positive impacts on having more sustainable and more inclusive social and economic growth. And this is particularly in a recovery phase that we are facing at the moment, a very important statement that we have to drive forward. There were statements of promoting the employment policies for job creation. Again, something that during the recovery stage has been a very important aspect to discuss. Ross already was talking about climate change. So from an ILO perspective, what is hugely important is a just transition to a future of work that takes the needs also of workers on board when it is discussing of how we are able to invest in the green economy further. The promotion of an acquisition of skills, if you think about some of the points that Rosa was mentioning about the technological change. So how are we implementing systems that assure that workers are actually equipped to use and to implement some of these new technologies is a very important aspect. And lastly, achieving gender equality is one of the main issues that need to be looked into, particularly when we talk about the recovery from COVID-19. There are plenty of reports, and I will go into that a little bit more later in this presentation, that really highlight the overall impact on women due to COVID-19 has been much higher than for men, given a number of different circumstances. They tend to be overrepresented in sectors that were most hit by the pandemic, such as health, for example, but they also tend to be overrepresented, for example, in the informal economy. Again, workers which have been very, very vulnerable throughout the crisis. And another point that I will be making. So, I mean, one may still have, questions even going through some of these points of how does the Centenary Declaration matter, right? Well, what is really the value added of a discussion that had no COVID in mind, as it were, that was looking at a world which is fundamentally different than the world that we're seeing today? And my arguments, or the ILO's arguments, would be, that it is still hugely relevant. And one of the reasons why is because, and like was already said, the COVID-19 crisis has not affected everyone equally. We've seen huge impacts, how already existing inequalities, already existing precarities has led to the fact that the impact of the pandemic has been much, much worse on certain groups of workers, for example, and employers for that matter. And so the inequalities that we've seen already prior to the crisis, which were very much part and parcel of the future of work discussions, have been greatly exacerbated throughout the COVID-19 crisis. So this is a hugely important aspect why we should still be talking about some of the elements of the future of work today. The second point is, and I've mentioned this already, is that all constituents have adopted this declaration. This is a political statement by all member states, by workers, employers, and governments that have politically committed to that. And as such, from an ILO perspective, it provides a very important roadmap that is very much the basis of the ILO's work over the last 2 years. And as such, it provides a very important roadmap also throughout the pandemic that we're seeing today. And I just wanted to highlight, and I could give a very much longer presentation on some of these impacts, but I just wanted to give you a few statistics that just showcase just how much this precarity has actually exacerbated the employment impact of COVID-19 over the last year and a half. And the first one I wanted to look at is the reduction in working hours by certain groups and by certain regions. So what we're seeing here is that the impact in 2020 of the reduction in the dark blue, you see unemployment. In turquoise, you see the inactivity level. So these are workers which due to COVID-19 have both basically fallen out of the labor market. And then in red, you see those workers who have remained in employment, but whose working hours have been reduced due to work arrangements such as zero-hour contracts, for example. And if you want to look at the Americas figure, that includes statistics on the Caribbean, you see that even if the unemployment impact has been quite severe and definitely more severe than in any other region, what is staggering is that the inactivity figure has been massive. So what that tells us is that workers have been very much been falling out of the labor market and have been falling out of the social security systems and have not been benefiting as much as formal employment for formal workers, for example, from any given state interventions that may alleviate the impact of COVID-19. So this is a huge concern that we're having, that, you know, unemployment is something that is, of course, concerning, but this huge surge in the informal economy, in particular, in workers that have become very much inactive, is something that we need to consider in much more detail. And this is something that we see even if you look at the impact disaggregated by gender and age. So, you know, female unemployment has been increasing, particularly at the very beginning of the pandemic, but the inactivity rates, and this is coming back to the fact that a lot of women are actually engaged in the informal economy, has been a huge impact. And the same can be said for youth, which have been, you know, mainly employed in a lot of the developing countries in the informal economy, in sectors that have been predominantly impacted by COVID-19. And therefore, this is something that we need to consider much more strongly, that these are workers that we've effectively, from a regulatory standpoint, are losing. These are workers that we are not be reaching anymore through any given government impact that we may see due to COVID-19. The last figure I want to show you is, and this is very much linked to the earning factor or the impact of earnings that we've seen of the informal economy. And these are just figures for the first month or the first months of the crisis, so the beginning of 2020. But this is just to showcase, if you look at the first figure, that the median earnings for informal economy workers around the globe have reduced by almost 2/3 throughout the crisis. And this is in countries where they have no other access to income other than, you know, their wages in that sense. So poverty rates have been increasing predominantly due to the crisis, since the amount of informal economy workers are not just increasing, but their earnings have been very much impacted by the crisis. So from an ILO perspective, you know, how are we integrating some of these findings, some of these really shocking experiences that we've been seeing over the last year and a half, with some of the findings that we have seen throughout the future of work discussion. So at the recent Future of Work International Labour Conference that was held in June of 2021, the constituents of the ILO came together, and they called for a global call for action to achieve a human-centered recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. And again, I just wanted to highlight how these are actually linked. So in the chapeau of this particular call for action, all constituents agreed that the ILO Centenary Declaration, so essentially the discussion on the future of work, provide very much the foundation to the recovery from the crisis that is fully inclusive, sustainable, and resilient to support this transition. So again, the declaration is the one that offers a positive vision and a roadmap for how countries can build forward better. So this is very much the crux of the matter. So what does that mean in practice? And I just want to highlight very much the structure. I very much invite you to go to the ILO, to engage with also the office in Port of Spain if you require further information or materials on these. But you know, just to highlight just a few points on the structure, and again, some of these elements are very familiar to you, and they are very much part and parcel of this particular workers' forum as well. So the call for action is divided into two sort of parts. We're talking about a policy part where there are many aspects on the inclusive economic growth and employment, on protection of all workers, on the need for universal social protection, and of course on sort of social dialogue as important measures to go forward towards a human-centered recovery. The second point, and I would love to go into more detail, but I see that I'm just running out of time, so I'll just highlight one or two of these points. The second point is very much geared towards what the ILO leadership can do in support to said recovery. So you know, the role of the ILO within the multilateral system is hugely important in that regard. I think the way that you know, all constituents, all member states will have to engage strongly together in terms of achieving the Agenda 2030 and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals will be hugely important in order to recover to the point where we can look into a much brighter future. So, you know, and very briefly, just what does that mean in terms of a long-term recovery for? So if you look at figures from the World Bank and the IMF, for example, they will actually tell you that they have forecast, you know, positive economic growth in most countries, including in countries in the Caribbean for 2022 and 2023. But crucially, and this is, you know, a little bit the point of the whole exercise, unless there are certain policy measures that we're taking now, this will simply not benefit everyone in society. So for the recovery to reach everyone, policies very much have to look into how can states, how can trade unions, how can employers' organizations reach all and very much the most precarious workers in society in order to make sure that we are actually recovering equitable. You know, we have to ensure that young workers in particular, given that they've been predominantly impacted by the crisis, have decent job and education opportunities going forward. Otherwise, we are running the risk of a lockdown generation where the impact on future earnings will persist throughout the decades to come. We have to ensure that gender inequalities, both at home and at the workplace, are fully addressed in order to recover. And of course, social protection is a hugely important part of that. So ultimately, what we need to look actually, when we talk about the recovery from COVID-19, is how are we addressing the pre-existing inequalities that the Future of Work Initiative has been discussing for a number of years already. So, you know, in conclusion, discussions like we're having today, these forums that you've been organizing today are hugely relevant, not just to look at the long-term trends of some of these drivers that we've already been mentioned, but they're hugely relevant in order to have a recovery that builds forward better. And therefore, you know, I very much welcome this discussion today. I'm very much looking forward to the Q&A session that is following. But for now, I just thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.